Jon Snow had always felt a restlessness within him, a silent question echoing in his mind like the hush of falling snow on the battlements of Winterfell. He remembered the gray walls of the castle that raised him, the quiet watchfulness of his lord father's eyes, and the half-averted gazes of those who saw in him only a bastard. He had grown accustomed to existing in the shadows, taking all of his solace from the warmth he gleaned from his siblings who had never questioned his presence, only accepted it, and the honorable strength of Eddard Stark, who was father to them all, in blood or in name. Yet the older he became, the more Jon realized how his very existence was a swirl of uncertainty, something that hovered over him like a chill wind down the spine. He had felt it constantly as he lingered in the courtyard training with wooden swords or exchanging glances with Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon in the Great Hall. There was no room for illusions. He was a Snow and they were Starks. But one day everything changed, though not as he ever would have imagined. He had scarcely seen 15 name days when King Robert Baratheon himself came bearing a new command that defied all sense. Jon remembered feeling a tremor in the marrow of his bones in the quiet hush of a cool northern morning when he heard the news: a raven had arrived from King's Landing. Ned Stark had read it, his normally unreadable expression flickering with a tension that did not often grace his features. His lips parted and he murmured something about the king's will. Something about an alliance. Something that would tear Jon Snow from the familiar stone of Winterfell and thrust him into a future he had never considered. That day in the Great Hall, with its banners of the dire wolf drifting in the draft, Eddard Stark explained the king's demand. Jon Snow was to wed Shireen Baratheon, the only surviving child of Lord Stannis Baratheon, but ward of the king and effectively under Robert's guardianship. The king had decreed that such a union would, in time, seal the loyalty of the North with the Stormlands. In King Robert's mind, the legitimization of Jon, paired with the name of Shireen, would serve as a bulwark against any threat to the kingdom's unity. For better or worse, Robert had found a method to bind House Stark, or at least the blood of House Stark, to the might of the Baratheons in the Stormlands. Yet to do so, Jon Snow would be uprooted. He would be recognized as a true Stark, or so the king's letter suggested, a newly named Jon Stark who would hold some share of the North's inheritance. The details were murky, subject to the crown's whims. Jon could scarcely believe the talk. He lingered in a swirl of uncertainty, gazing into the steady eyes of the man he called father. Eddard Stark had never been one to readily contradict a king he regarded as a friend, but it was evident he was displeased. There was a heaviness in the air as Ned explained. Robert Baratheon, as a friend or no, was still a king, and to deny such a demand was fraught with peril. Did Ned truly want to refuse? Yes, Jon could sense that in the stoic lines of his father's jaw. But the realm was delicate. Whispers of trouble in the east, rumors of dragons stirring, and the lingering threat of Lannister power at the heart of King's Landing. There were too many uncertain pieces on the board. What stunned Jon more than anything was that, for a moment, Ned seemed to be on the verge of revealing something, as if he might speak a truth long buried. The Lord of Winterfell's breath caught in his throat before he said, with an unmistakable reluctance, that they must comply with Robert's request. The crown had insisted on this union. Winterfell itself might be imperiled should they refuse. And so, without fanfare, the matter was decided. A hush lingered among the watchers, Catelyn Stark with her posture stiff as a statue carved from ice, Robb with an open mouth as if he wanted to protest and was unsure how, Sansa and Arya exchanging sidelong glances of confusion. Only the younger ones were too small to comprehend the depth of what had happened. Jon, for his part, felt as though he had been tossed into a swift-flowing river, uncertain how to swim or even if he dared. He had seen Shireen Baratheon once when the royal family and all their retinue visited Winterfell to name Eddard Stark Hand of the King. But Shireen had traveled with Stannis only briefly. Jon recalled the fleeting glimpse of a solemn-faced young girl, her skin marked by the aftermath of grayscale, timid and sweet in the shadows of her father's stern bearing. She had large, thoughtful eyes, and she rarely spoke, as if she thought the world might mock her. She spent most of her time in the presence of Princess Myrcella or alone with her septa. Jon had scarcely noticed her back then, enthralled as he was by the notion of the royal visit and by the king's towering presence which overshadowed everyone else. Now, however, that shy girl was to be his betrothed, and the demands came from King Robert himself. In the weeks that followed, Winterfell's usually quiet routines became clouded with gossip and uncertain goodbyes. Jon's footsteps dragged across the courtyard as he finished his days with the Master-at-Arms practicing sword forms. He felt 1,000 eyes upon him, from servants and guards and even his siblings. Catelyn Stark maintained an almost brittle politeness. The necessity of the match was clear to her, but her distaste was not so well hidden. Jon was uncertain which pained her more, that the king had chosen Ned Stark's baseborn son for such an arrangement, or that she would see the North's alliances made partially through him rather than one of her own trueborn children. Robb offered him subdued congratulations, then promptly invited him for a spar to burn off the tension. Arya, in her usual brashness, asked Jon if he was going to become a real lord now. Sansa, half curious and half aloof, remarked that Shireen might prefer southern entertainments to the snows of the north. Bran and Rickon were too young to grasp the intricacies, but they looked on with wide eyes whenever the marriage was mentioned. Jon found his mind a battlefield. On one hand, there was a quiet, flickering sense of pride, to be legitimized, to no longer bear the name Snow, to have some form of a rightful place. But the word Stark fit him like an ill-tailored cloak. He had dreamt of it but never truly believed it could be his. And on the other, there was a gnawing worry for the girl he knew nothing about, for the life that would be forced upon him, for the father he left behind. Eddard Stark would not speak much of it. His final words before Jon's departure were something akin to a warning. There are truths you do not know. But the king is set in his will. You must go to King's Landing. You must do your duty. The day Jon rode south, the sky was gray with low-lying clouds, spitting snow flurries that dusted the travelers in a thin coat of white. He kept his cloak tight around his shoulders, the Stark sigil newly sewn at his breast, an honor for a boy who had once merely been known as bastard if recognized at all. With him rode a small retinue of men loyal to Eddard Stark, 1 or 2 from the garrison, along with a steward to attend to letters and a pair of maids, all to represent Winterfell at court. Even Theon Greyjoy offered a farewell of sorts, though it was half sneer, half jest. So you're to be a real boy now, hey, Snow? Good luck with that, and mind the southern heat doesn't melt your northern bones. Jon resisted responding with anger. He was too overwhelmed. He left Winterfell that day, not knowing if he would see his family again for a year, or 2, or longer. The knowledge clung to him, burning behind his eyelids, and so he simply rode forward, silent in his saddle, trying to imagine what fate might await him at the end of the King's Road. The road south was not easy, but Jon was able to experience more of the realm than he ever had. Past the neck and into the riverlands, the climate grew milder, the fields greener. Along the way, they encountered traders, pilgrims, and knights traveling for 100 different reasons. Often at night, Jon caught himself lost in thought. He tried to picture Shireen's face. What little he remembered of the girl from that single fleeting meeting was hazy. He recalled a scar that curled along her cheek and the side of her forehead from the grayscale's remnants. He imagined her to be quiet and kind, but timid, overshadowed by Stannis' stoicism and the gravity of her own unfortunate illness. He felt a pang in his heart, wondering if she had chosen any of this. Surely not. They were both pawns in Robert Baratheon's grand design for unifying the North and the Stormlands. King's Landing soared into sight after many weeks of travel. It was a city of sun-baked walls, teeming crowds, and an odor that struck Jon's senses like a wave of rotting fish and sweat. The capital was unlike the North in every aspect. A tumult of color, motion, and suspicion swirled in every alley. At the Red Keep, the banners of House Baratheon and House Lannister fluttered. The gold cloaks kept watch. Servants scurried about. And at the center of it all stood the towering seat of power, the Iron Throne resting within. Jon dismounted, ignoring the fatigue in his bones. The retinue from Winterfell arrived in the courtyard, and soon the king's stewards whisked them to appointed rooms, large enough, though hardly comfortable to a mind used to the simpler solemnities of the North. Jon had scarcely caught his breath when he was summoned to the king's presence. He tidied himself hastily, feeling an unaccustomed weight in his limbs. He donned a finely woven tunic with a dire wolf embroidered at the collar. He had never worn something of such quality before, but he realized that from now on, appearances mattered. He found King Robert in a solar adjacent to the throne room with a plate of half-eaten roast boar in front of him and a golden goblet of wine in hand. The king's eyes glittered with easy humor when Jon entered. Perhaps Robert recalled him from their earlier meeting, or perhaps the king was simply in a jovial mood, for he clapped Jon on the shoulder with a familiarity that startled him. "Well met, Snow. But soon enough you won't be called Snow." "Eh, boy," Robert said in that booming, hearty voice. Jon felt the heavy weight of that hand on his shoulder. "I have it in mind to make you a Stark proper. And once you're a Stark, you're wedding to my niece. Yes, I know, Stannis' girl, but all the same, she's of my blood. We'll tie the North to the Stormlands in a neat little package." Jon gulped but tried not to show his unease. He had expected no less, but it was daunting to stand in front of the man who was not only the realm's king but also the one reconfiguring Jon's entire life. "Your Grace," Jon managed, bending the knee. "I am honored by your trust in me." Robert let out a satisfied noise. Well, your father and I fought side by side. He was always the honorable sort, though by the gods I never understood how he stomached the cold. But I do know that if I tie my house to his, the kingdom stands stronger. And that's what we need in these times. Gods know what troubles brew across the sea, or even in my own court. At that, the king's grin thinned. You'll have the name Stark. I'll see to that. And once you're wed, perhaps I'll place you in some official role, something to keep your sword arm honed. Robert downed a deep swallow of wine. But first things first, the girl. You'll want to meet her again, reacquaint yourselves. She's a shy one, per child, but sweet enough. Just remember she's Baratheon stock. There's strength in her. Jon bowed his head, murmuring his thanks. He felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, but he kept them well hidden. That was a skill he had cultivated in Winterfell, being the bastard among legitimate children. Even so, he couldn't quite quell the anxiety that flared in his chest as he followed the attendants through labyrinthine corridors to the wing where Shireen Baratheon resided. She received him in a small garden courtyard behind a wall of the Red Keep. The greenery was lush compared to the north, with rose vines and small lemon trees in ornate pots. Fountains trickled with water. A handful of ladies stood at a discreet distance, and across a narrow corridor, one of King's Landing's famed septas waited in silent vigilance. Shireen stood near a bench wearing a pale blue gown embroidered with stags, the symbol of her father's house. Jon immediately saw the scarring on her left cheek and across her brow, but she held herself with composure. Though she was barely his age, close to it, give or take a year, her eyes reflected a curious mixture of sadness and resolve. Jon bowed. He could think of nothing to say except, "My lady." She inclined her head, that small motion tinged with a quiet, nervous dignity. "My lord, although they tell me you're not yet a lord, but you will be." Her voice was soft. There was a mild tremor to it, as if she dreaded somehow displeasing him. Jon felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "I suppose that is the plan," Jon said awkwardly. The hush of the courtyard pressed down on him. "My father told me of the king's arrangement." Shireen nodded. "My father wrote me from Dragonstone. He said I must do my duty, that King Robert had decided this was best for House Baratheon." Her fingers twisted in the folds of her gown. I am not unhappy to meet you, my lord Jon. I remember you from Winterfell. You seemed kind." Jon tried to recall if they had ever exchanged words in those few days. Possibly not. He had been too embroiled with Robb and the others, too busy, overshadowed by the presence of the king's retinue and the Lannisters. But he was relieved by Shireen's calm acknowledgement. If they were both pawns in this match, at least they could face it together. "If I ever gave offense, I'm sorry." She shook her head, her thinning hair swaying around her young face. "No offense. You were Ned Stark's son, and I was just the quiet girl. I'm sorry if this is strange for you." Jon almost laughed. Of course it was strange. Everything about the situation was. Yet it was not her fault, nor was it truly his. "We'll figure it out," he said, with all the sincerity he could muster. "I don't know the South very well. It would help to have a friend." She gave him the faintest hint of a smile, like a shy fawn peeking from behind the forest brush. "A friend, yes, that would be nice." And so, in those first days at the Red Keep, Jon found himself spending small increments of time in Shireen's company, walking along the edges of the castle gardens, or sharing a midday meal in a small hall assigned for lesser lords and ladies. They were both awkward, for the notion of an impending betrothal weighed heavily on them, but they began to speak. Shireen told him of her life in Dragonstone, of how lonely it could be, battered by storms, with few companions to confide in beyond her fool Patchface and a handful of loyal maids. She told him about her grayscale affliction, how it had nearly claimed her life when she was just an infant, and though she had survived, she carried the scars that made people stare. Jon, in return, shared memories of Winterfell, snowball fights with his siblings, the warmth of the great hearth in the main hall, the direwolves that wandered the grounds, particularly Ghost, his own. Jon discovered that her shyness masked a sweet nature, a yearning for acceptance. She seemed astonished he would speak with her so freely, that he didn't recoil from her scars. It made Jon's heart ache. He understood the sense of being on the outside looking in, though his own brand of isolation had come from the question of his parentage. That sympathy opened an unexpected bond between them. Their betrothal ceremony was arranged by the king a fortnight after Jon's arrival. It was a modest affair, considering the station of the participants. The king did not want to overshadow the betrothal of the bastard-turned-near-lord. So he arranged a small gathering in the royal September. Queen Cersei was nowhere in sight. apparently uninterested in indulging her husband's political maneuver, and that hardly surprised Jon. The men of the court who cared attended, along with the Master of Laws, a representative from the faith, and a handful of lesser lords. King Robert himself presided, dripping with the confidence of one who expected no opposition to his will. Eddard Stark was absent, too far away in Winterfell, and Jon felt that absence like a pang in his chest. Shireen stood quietly with her head bowed as they recited the words of formal betrothal. Jon made his vows, voice steady enough, repeating the lines as instructed. They would be wed in 6 months' time, or once Shireen reached her name day that marked her 15th year, whichever date the king ultimately set. Robert announced that, upon that day, Jon Snow would legally become Jon Stark by royal decree and hold rank as Lord of Summerhall, a ruin in the Stormlands that the crown had not rebuilt, but which existed on parchment as a courtesy title. A hush rippled through the small crowd. Jon recognized the honor, but it felt hollow, contrived. Still, he knelt and swore his fealty to the king. Afterward, the king clapped Jon's shoulder again, raising a toast of dark arbor red to the new alliance between North and Stormlands. Shireen accepted a respectful kiss on the hand from Jon, her cheeks coloring. Across the sept, the watchers applauded politely. When it was done, Jon had a curious feeling that he had left his childhood behind forever. King Robert, flush with wine, pulled Jon aside later that evening. They stood on a balcony overlooking the moonlit waters of Blackwater Bay. "Boy," the king said, "I realize this may all seem forced, but you should thank me. As a bastard, you had no prospects of note. Now you'll be a lord with a wife of Baratheon blood. You might not think me a friend, but I swear to you, I do this for the sake of the realm, and yes, for your father's sake. You'll be better off than you ever dreamed once everything is settled." Jon bowed his head, unsure of what to feel. Perhaps gratitude, but also a vague sense of being used as a tool. "I understand my duty, your grace," he managed. "I will serve faithfully." Robert's grin flashed in the moonlight. "I'm certain you will, lad. Now go on, rest. We've a feast planned in a few days' time, and then I'll see about what to do with you in the interim. I suspect Eddard will want you to spend time with the Master-at-Arms. We can't have you going soft." In the days that followed, Jon's life settled into a surreal routine. He joined the Red Keep's training yard each morning, sparring with men far more experienced than himself, yet he held his own, shaped as he was by the tutelage of Winterfell. In the afternoons, he studied with a maester assigned to teach him the protocols of southern courts, the lineage of the Baratheons, and the complexities of feudal alliances. Occasionally, he would be called to attend Shireen in the gardens or accompany her to the September. She was devout, it turned out, or at least took comfort in the rituals of the Seven, something Jon had rarely encountered in the North's worship of the old gods. She told him once, shyly, that the faith offered her hope in lonely times. Jon began to suspect that Shireen's mother, Lady Celis, had little interest in her daughter's well-being. The woman remained at Dragonstone more often than not, or so rumor said, leaving Shireen mostly in the king's care or the king's neglect, as he rarely interacted with her except to bark orders. So Shireen was a lonely child perched at the edges of court, overshadowed by the intrigues of the Lannisters and the Tyrells and all the other powers swirling around the capital. She seemed surprised whenever Jon showed genuine concern for her day or her feelings. She would reward him with these tentative smiles. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they were forging a companionship that might one day be called friendship. Yet beneath that fragile progress, storm clouds gathered in Jon's mind. He was in a court he knew little about, surrounded by political vipers. He saw how the Lannisters held themselves aloof and how courtiers whispered about the king's affairs. He noticed how Peter Baelish and Varys the Spider exchanged cryptic remarks. Jon had the keen sense that he was a piece on a game board of cunning players. If he erred, he could invite disaster on himself or the Starks. So he moved carefully, speaking only when needed, trying to mirror his father's quiet composure. Occasionally, letters arrived from Winterfell. Robb's first missive had been filled with curiosity and jest, but also with brotherly encouragement. Bran sent him a letter dictated by Maester Luwin, telling him about news stories he'd heard of the children of the forest. Arya scribbled a few lines of complaint about the ways of southern ladies, mocking how they sipped tea and tittered over gossip. Sansa's letter was proper and polite, congratulating him on the betrothal. None came from Lady Catelyn, which did not surprise Jon. Eddard's letters were straightforward, though Jon could sense Ned's lingering disquiet beneath the formalities. The king's demands still weighed heavily on the Lord of Winterfell, but he was not in a position to openly resist. Jon spent hours in the Red Keep's library as well, reading ancient tomes on the histories of the North, the Stormlands, and the Targaryen conquest. Something about the old stories stirred in him. He read of the bastard heroes who had risen to prominence, though they were few. He studied maps of the Stormlands, trying to picture Summerhall's ruined estate. If he was destined to inherit a title from there, he might as well learn its significance. It had once been a summer palace for Targaryen kings, destroyed by fire, leaving behind charred rubble. Robert apparently thought it a fitting courtesy title, perhaps ironically, perhaps simply because it was at hand. From time to time, Shireen would sit quietly beside him in the library, reading a different tome or paging through a book of legends. She told Jon she especially enjoyed tales of the Age of Heroes, though she sometimes lamented that the stories rarely told of any heroic women. Jon found himself gently encouraging her, lending her a battered old volume about Nymeria and the Rhoynar, or mentioning that his sister Arya admired bold female figures from the histories. Shireen's soft smiles during those moments felt like a sliver of light in the often cold atmosphere of the castle. Months drifted by, until the day came for the king to issue the official royal decree. Jon Snow was to be recognized legally as Jon Stark, with full rights and privileges. The king's council hashed out the details. Jon sat in the hall, listening to the pronouncement, feeling his stomach tighten. He had dreamt of being a Stark for so long, a child's fantasy of belonging. Yet this was not how he had ever expected it to happen. A hush fell as Robert sealed the parchment with the crown seal. Jon felt a sense of unreality, as if he stood outside himself. He half expected Ned Stark to appear and intervene, to say there was more to be said. But Eddard was in Winterfell. The king did as he wished. That night, in a small ceremony in front of a scattering of courtiers, the decree was read aloud. Jon Snow was now Jon Stark. Varys, ever the observer, offered mild applause, while Peter Baelish smirked. Ser Barristan Selmy, standing at attention in his white cloak, gave a faint nod of approval. Cersei Lannister was nowhere to be seen, and Prince Joffrey was similarly absent. The king concluded with a hearty statement that the wedding would proceed in 6 months. Final date to be fixed as soon as Shireen reached her name day. Afterward, there was a quiet dinner. Shireen congratulated him, face still uncertain. "Jon Stark," she said softly. "It must feel strange." He nodded. "More than I can say." She studied him carefully, seeming to wrestle with her own reticence. If this is all forced upon you, I'm sorry." Jon shook his head. "You have no need to apologize. We both have our roles to play." She lowered her gaze. The flickering torchlight highlighted the pattern of her old scars. "Perhaps we can try to make the best of it." Jon realized the sincerity in her words. He dipped his head in agreement. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I think we can." As the days melted into weeks, life in King's Landing continued. Intrigues thrummed through the corridors like an ever-present hum. Jon discovered that the Lannisters had begun to show a sort of dismissive interest in him. He was summoned once to speak with the Queen, but he found her words laced with condescension. She told him how she hoped the union would bring no harm to the realm, that the king's generosity should not be squandered, and how the throne had endless demands. Jon listened politely, offered measured replies, and left with the sense that she saw him as a potential inconvenience. Another tie between Ned Stark and the king, a tie that might threaten the Lannister hold on power. Tommen and Myrcella were too young to care much about these politics, though from time to time, Myrcella played with Shireen in the keep's gardens. Shireen seemed glad to have some company, though even that was tinged with formality. Joffrey remained aloof, glowering whenever he spotted Jon in the courtyard, as though offended by the presence of a northern bastard. Bastard no longer, though Joffrey likely did not bother to note the distinction. Jon saw no point in engaging with the prince. He had heard rumors of Joffrey's cruelty, and he wanted no trouble. Thus, half a year passed in a careful dance. Jon turned 16 in that time. He grew taller, and his sword arm grew stronger with the daily training. The knights in the yard came to respect his skill, though a few sneered at his origin. Shireen's name day approached, and the king set the wedding date 2 weeks after that. Whispers began to echo through the court. People wondered if the union would truly strengthen the realm, or if it was a passing fancy of the king. Still, Robert Baratheon insisted, and what Robert demanded in these matters he generally received. Jon saw little of Stannis Baratheon, Shireen's father, who had returned to Dragonstone with a stony silence. Stannis was known for his stubbornness and sense of duty, but rumor held that he resented King Robert's meddling in Shireen's future. He had wanted to oversee the betrothal himself, yet the king's decree had forced his hand. The friction between the royal brothers was an open secret in the Red Keep. But Stannis's personal feelings did not matter as much as the king's will. Shireen's mother did not appear either. So the girl's primary guardianship remained with King Robert in King's Landing. As the wedding day drew near, the Great Sept was prepared. King Robert insisted on a modest but respectable ceremony, far smaller than a royal wedding, but enough spectacle to remind the realm that House Stark and House Baratheon were forging a bond. Jon felt a knot of apprehension. Day by day, it tightened. He found some measure of comfort in Shireen's presence. The more time they spent together, the more he realized she was quietly clever. She was quick with sums and had a memory for genealogies that rivaled a maester's. Often, she had a self-effacing manner that made her appear less confident than she was, but in truth, she possessed a will that refused to be broken by the scornful glances she endured. Jon admired that in her. When the day finally arrived, the city stirred early, the bells echoing through the streets. Courtiers and lords from nearby houses assembled in the Red Keep, some likely attending only to keep favor with the king. Jon rose at dawn, his heart pounding. He dressed in a doublet of pale gray embroidered with the dire wolf, a black cloak clasped with silver. It was the garb of House Stark, though the gold stag of Baratheon was soon to be entwined with it. The king had commanded that half a dozen lords of the Stormlands stand witness, as well as the small party from Winterfell that had ridden south days before the ceremony. Robb and Sansa, accompanied by Maester Luwin and a few others. Jon was grateful to see his half-brother, to share a word or two of reassurance. Shireen was escorted by the king himself into the sept. She wore a gown of bright yellow, the color of the Baratheon banners, with small black stags stitched across the bodice. A flowing maiden's cloak draped her shoulders. The sept was aglow with candlelight, the crystal windows filtering colored light onto the marble floors. The High Septon officiated, voice reverberating beneath the grand dome. Jon felt Shireen's trembling hand slip into his as they stood before the altar. He gave it a small, reassuring squeeze. The words of the ceremony passed in a blur. Vows were exchanged, prayers spoken to the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, and the stranger. Jon felt sweat prickle on his brow despite the relative cool of the September. He saw Robb and Sansa watching from one side, their expressions a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The king, near the front row, beamed in satisfaction, draining from a flask in the midst of the solemn rites. So typical of Robert Baratheon. At last, Jon draped the cloak of House Stark over Shireen's shoulders, signifying that she was under his protection. The final pronouncement bound them as man and wife. Applause trickled through the sept, more polite than exuberant. But the formality was done. House Stark and House Baratheon were now linked through Jon and Shireen. Jon saw Shireen's features flush, her eyes shining with tears not entirely of sorrow. There was relief, yes, but also fear. She turned to face him, and they exchanged an uncertain kiss that tasted of nerves and possibility. Afterward came the feast, modest by King's Landing standards but still grand to Jon's northern eyes. Rows of tables were laden with roasted fowl, spiced honey cakes, sweet wine, and platters of fruit. Minstrels played. Courtiers congratulated the newlyweds with hollow niceties. Shireen barely touched her food, nibbling here and there. Jon managed a few bites but mostly occupied himself with redirecting attention from Shireen whenever she appeared overwhelmed. He discovered that he was protective of her, resenting the stares that lingered on her scarred cheek or the pitying looks directed at her. As the evening stretched, Robert eventually roared for more wine, toasting to the newly made Jon Stark. At that, the king beckoned to the steward who carried the official documents. Robert bellowed for silence and declared that the realm now recognized Jon as a Stark in blood and in name, a courtesy allowed by the king for the sake of unity, reaffirming him as the Lord of Summerhall. Jon forced a polite smile as the gathered guests applauded. He felt Shireen's slight hand creep onto his arm. She was trembling again, or perhaps that was only his imagination. The bedding ceremony loomed at the end of the feast, a tradition that Jon dreaded. It was typical in southern weddings for the newlyweds to be carried to the bridal chamber by rowdy guests who would strip them along the way amid boisterous jokes. Shireen was only 15 and Jon himself was barely 16. The idea filled him with a sense of protective anger, but tradition was not easily dismissed in King's Landing. He could see the red flush in Shireen's cheeks when the guests began chanting. To his relief, King Robert, perhaps noticing Shireen's fearful expression, shouted for the crowd to calm themselves. He waved a dismissive hand. "That's enough, let them go in peace. I won't have my niece frightened to death on her wedding night." His words were slurred with wine, but his command was absolute. The crowd, thus chastised, shifted awkwardly, but they complied. Instead of the usual raucous betting, Jon escorted Shireen quietly from the hall. The hush that followed them out felt heavier than any cheer. They found themselves alone in a finely appointed chamber within the keep. A tall four-poster bed dominated the room. Candles glimmered, casting wavering shadows. Shireen stood in the center, twisting her hands together, her gaze turned down. Jon shut the door, the muffled hum of revelers beyond. Silence drew long and taut between them. He stepped forward, his own heart pounding. "Shireen," he said softly. "We don't have to," he swallowed. "If you're frightened, we can now." She looked up, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Yes. I mean, I'm not." She paused, struggling for words. Everything is so new. So sudden. I barely know what to do." Jon exhaled, relieved. He had no desire to rush her into any intimacy she did not welcome. Their marriage was political, yes, but they were both still so young. "We can take our time," he said quietly. "This night can be just that, a night. We can talk, or simply rest. I won't press you for anything you don't wish." Tears glimmered in her eyes, and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. With a tentative step, she moved toward him and rested her forehead against his chest. Jon felt the warmth of her presence, the flutter of her breath. He gently circled his arms around her, his mind still reeling from how life had twisted him into this moment. But there was a profound sense of gentleness there, too, a sense of duty not imposed by the king but by his own conscience. That night, they spoke in soft voices, halting at times, about what might come next, about how to navigate the court, about small glimpses of their childhoods. Shireen confessed that she worried she would never be a proper lady to sit at Jon's side, that her scarring and her timidity would make her an object of ridicule. Jon spoke honestly, telling her that he understood the pain of being judged. He assured her that they would stand together. Eventually, sleep claimed them, fully clothed, side by side on top of the coverlet. When morning light pierced the window, Jon stirred and found Shireen still sleeping, her face relaxed in the hush of slumber. For a moment, he let himself think that this might become a bond worth more than the king's political aims. With a careful motion, he rose and left to see about the day, letting her rest. Now that the wedding was sealed, the king turned his attention to what to do with this new alliance. There were words about sending Jon and Shireen back to the Stormlands so that Jon could begin the process of rebuilding Summerhall, or at least establishing some presence there. Others claimed that the king wanted them to remain in King's Landing for a time so he could keep an eye on them. Jon had little say in the matter, but day by day he came to realize that wearing the mantle of a lord meant wearing 1,000 invisible chains. Every step was watched, every conversation dissected. He found few he could trust in King's Landing aside from Shireen and the handful of northerners who accompanied him. He maintained polite relations with the older knights, with the council members, but he felt the intangible lines of faction and power. More letters came from Ned Stark instructing him to remain vigilant. Rumors were swirling about the Mad King's surviving heirs across the Narrow Sea. Whispers abounded of Daenerys Targaryen who might or might not have dragons. The realm could be in peril. Robert was anxious, though he hid it behind feasts and hunts. In one letter, Ned Stark alluded to new tensions with the Lannisters, cryptic references to the parentage of the royal children. Jon read the lines, perplexed, but gleaned that something was rotting at the core of the realm's leadership. Then, at last, Robert declared that Jon and Shireen would travel to Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon, and from there proceed to Summerhall to see their new holdings. "It's high time you know the Stormlands," the king said with a wave of his wine cup. "Bast Stark, you'll not be a true lord of that region if you don't set foot there. And the men of the Stormlands should see that my niece is properly settled. Perhaps Stannis will show his face, though I doubt it. He sulks on Dragonstone." Jon tried not to let his relief show too plainly. King's Landing felt suffocating. Perhaps in the Stormlands, there would be more room to breathe, fewer watchful eyes. Shireen herself was uncertain, but she tried to hide her apprehension behind a polite smile. "I've never been to Summerhall," she confided to Jon. "All I know is that it's a ruin." He nodded. "Perhaps we can make something of it together." 2 weeks later, they departed. Their caravan was modest, guarded by some of the king's men. They traveled the Rose Road heading south, then branched east, crossing into the Stormlands. True to their name, the Stormlands greeted them with driving rain, howling winds that battered the windows of their carriage. Shireen shivered in the damp and Jon found himself missing the crisp, dry cold of the north. Still, the landscape had a rugged beauty. Cliffs and rocky shores lined much of the route, with ancient stands of forest inland. When they finally arrived at Storm's End, a massive fortress perched above the sea, Jon felt awe at its design. The walls were so thick that no storm or army could easily breach them. The keep soared like a sentinel overlooking the gray waves. Shireen seemed anxious as they entered, for she had spent little time there. Stannis' domain had largely been Dragonstone, but Storm's End was a seat for the main line of House Baratheon. The stewards and soldiers recognized Shireen, bowing deeply, though they also cast curious glances at Jon. He felt their scrutiny and carried himself with quiet dignity, remembering his father's lessons. Dignity costs nothing. For a few days, they stayed in Storm's End, recovering from the journey. The Castellan, Ser Courtenay Penrose, offered them courtesy and gave them a tour of the stronghold. Shireen followed along, shyly listening, while Jon asked questions about the fortress's history, the siege during Robert's rebellion, the cunning of Davos Seaworth who had smuggled onions in for Stannis. Even though the place was unfamiliar, its storied walls reminded Jon of the North's sense of heritage and resilience. Then they mounted a smaller expedition to Summerhall itself, a day's ride from Storm's End. The wind battered them, and heavy clouds loomed overhead, threatening another downpour. At last, the remains of Summerhall rose into view. It was an eerie sight, a broad clearing where once a castle had stood, with charred stone walls that were half collapsed, blackened timbers, and ivy creeping over broken archways. The Targaryens had built it as a summer palace centuries ago, but a catastrophic fire had consumed it decades past, on the same night that King Aegon V died, or so the story went. The land had never been properly reclaimed, though it remained on the royal ledgers. Now, by Robert's generosity or whim, it was assigned to Jon Stark and Shireen Baratheon Stark. Shireen gazed in silence at the desolation. Beside her, Jon studied the burned remnants, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the damp wind. This was a symbol of the realm's history, or perhaps a cautionary tale about power and hubris. Whatever it was now in their Han. DS to steward. They set up camp in what had once been an outer courtyard. Soldiers strung tarps between battered columns to keep out the rain. A makeshift stable was found among some collapsed sheds. Jon wandered amid the ruins, imagining how it might once have looked. Grand halls, tranquil gardens, laughter in the corridors. Now only ghosts of the past remained. Shireen followed him with a kind of subdued fascination. In the weeks that followed, they oversaw a small band of workers who cleared some of the rubble and pitched tents. Jon tried to think practically. Was there a reason to rebuild? Did it even make sense? The cost would be enormous. The king had given him the title, but no gold to fund a massive construction. Perhaps the best they could do was salvage a small area, construct a modest keep or a stone house for a permanent presence, and see if the surrounding lands could be farmed. Storm after storm lashed the camp, making the attempt to settle in more challenging. The wind whipped and howled, tearing at tents and rattling the half-standing walls. Shireen coughed through damp nights, though she insisted she was well. At times, Jon questioned if the king had exiled them to these battered remnants intentionally, or if Robert truly believed they could forge a new seat here. But they soldiered on, determined to show they were not mere children. In the quiet moments, Jon and Shireen formed a deeper bond than they ever had in the capital. Often they huddled around a small brazier for warmth, discussing their next steps. Shireen's knowledge of genealogies and castle records proved surprisingly useful. She found references to farmland near Summerhall and villages that once thrived under Targaryen patronage. Jon contributed his practicality, less about the paperwork, more about training the men, scouting the roads, ensuring the supplies came in. In a strange way, they complemented each other. They found reasons to laugh in the face of adversity. Occasionally, Shireen teased Jon about his northern stoicism, and he teased her about her habit of reading herself to sleep. Little by little, the local folk emerged, curious about these new arrivals. They were small folk, many of whom lived in scattered huts near the forests or the river. Some had stories of Targaryen ghosts haunting Summerhall, Others had superstitions about the place being cursed. Yet they recognized Shireen's status, her black and gold stags. They recognized the name Stark, too, if only from tales of the Warden of the North. Bit by bit, they began to approach with offers of help. A local stonemason who believed he could salvage part of the old foundations. A carpenter willing to build wooden shelters. Jon welcomed them, paid them from a small treasury allocated by the king, and sought to reassure them that House Baratheon Stark intended to restore some semblance of life to this place. As the moon cycles passed, a rudimentary settlement took shape in the old courtyard. Where blackened rubble once lay untouched, now temporary wooden structures rose. Workers cleared a portion of the palace's shelf for a storehouse. The smaller details of daily life pressed upon Jon as he oversaw rationing, negotiated with traveling merchants for building materials, and coordinated with Storm's End for ongoing shipments. He had never expected such practical drudgery to define his days, but he discovered a measure of purpose in it. With every newly placed beam or cart of stones, he felt he was building something that was theirs, not just the king's whim. At times, Shireen wandered among the laborers, her presence as lady of the keep unfamiliar to them. She was quiet and gentle, offering thanks whenever they accomplished a task. The small folk, seeing the scars on her face, sometimes looked away, uncertain how to address her. But she refused to cower or hide, and Jon admired her resolve. Slowly, they began to accept her presence, some even offering respectful nods. Shireen blossomed a little in that acceptance, shoulders less tense, eyes warmer. Yet tension still simmered beyond their little domain. Messages from King's Landing arrived sporadically, bearing word of the king's hunts, the Lannisters' maneuvers, rumors of Ned Stark's investigations, and the dangerous possibility of new conflicts. Jon worried for his father, for the north, for the realm. He and Shireen were still cogs in a grand machine, exiled to Summerhall to play house while powers shifted elsewhere. Sometimes, late at night, Jon would wonder if the king had only wanted them out of sight, removed from the swirl of politics that threatened to tear the realm apart. If so, they might be safer here, unless war came to the Stormlands, too. One chilly dusk, as a light rain drummed against the remnants of the palace walls, Jon found Shireen standing alone by a broken arch that overlooked the courtyard. She stared out at the workers packing up for the evening. Lanterns bobbed in the gloom, and the smell of wetwood wafted through the air. He approached quietly, and she turned, offering him a wan smile. "Sometimes I think this place is a symbol of how fragile everything is," she murmured. "It was once a grand palace, a dream of Targaryen might, and then it burned in a single night. It's as if we're trying to rebuild ashes." Jon rested a hand on the stones of the arch. "Maybe we are," he conceded. "But sometimes rebuilding from ashes is how you prove that life goes on, even after tragedy." She drew in a breath, releasing it softly. "Do you think we can do it? Make a life here?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I do. I didn't ask for any of this, nor did you. But I think we can make something worthwhile, something that's ours, not just the king's plan. It won't be easy. Nothing good ever is." Her hand slipped into his, fingers cool but steady. "I'm glad you think so." Jon squeezed her hand gently. "Shireen, I know we're bound by a vow that others forced upon us, but I've come to value our time together. Your counsel, your patience." He paused, uncertain how to phrase his thoughts. "You told me once that you were afraid your scars would be all that anyone saw. But I see you." Her eyes shone, tears threatening. She nodded, stepping closer so that her forehead brushed his chin, much as she had on their wedding night. They stood in silence, the wind swirling, the faint patter of rain around them. In that moment, neither felt entirely alone in this world. The weeks bled into months, and the settlement at Summerhall continued to grow, if slowly. Travelers began referring to it as a village, and Jon tried to keep the laborers motivated. Shireen corresponded regularly with the castellan at Storm's End, ensuring supplies. She discovered an aptitude for writing letters and balancing accounts, surprising herself. Through all of it, they were forging a new sense of belonging. But the realm's troubles would not be denied forever. A raven arrived one crisp morning, a black shape cutting across the gray sky. Jon took the message from the bird's leg and read it, feeling his heart sink. It was from Robb, penned in haste. It spoke of rumors that Ned Stark had been arrested in King's Landing on accusations of treason. The king had suffered a mortal wound on a hunting trip and was on his deathbed. Queen Cersei, Tywin Lannister, and their allies were moving swiftly, seizing control of the throne for Prince Joffrey. War loomed. Stunned, Jon swallowed. King Robert, dying? Treason accusations against Ned Stark? None of it made sense. Unless the rumors about the Lannisters and the parentage of the royal children were true and Ned had uncovered it. Jon felt a rush of fear and anger. His father could be facing execution. The North would not stand for that. War might tear the 7 kingdoms apart. Where did that leave Jon and Shireen? He sought out his wife immediately. She was in their makeshift solar, going over ledgers with the steward. At the look on his face, she dismissed the steward. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He told her everything. She paled, horror dimming the light in her eyes. "My uncle, he's dying?" she whispered, tears threatening. Despite everything, Robert Baratheon was her blood. "I knew he was reckless, but I never imagined," her voice caught. "I gods and your father, the accusations of treason." "We need to decide what to do," Jon said, forcing himself to remain calm. "If the queen and her father have seized power, then we have to assume no mercy will be shown to my father. The North may rebel. Robb's letter suggests he's already calling the banners. If Ned is executed..." Shireen shook her head, tears slipping free. "We're alone here, Jon. We have only a handful of guards. Storm's End is weeks away by Raven. Dragonstone is under my father's control, but I don't know if that helps. Joffrey. He despises anything connected to Robert that isn't purely Lannister." Jon's fists clenched. "We might become targets. You're Robert's niece. If the Lannisters see you as a threat, we could be in danger. They might see this alliance as a threat to Joffrey's legitimacy." Shireen nodded, swallowing. "We have to choose carefully. My father might rally to oppose Joffrey, or he might attempt to claim the throne himself if he believes it rightful. It's complicated. But if there's war... Oh gods, Jon, this is so much bigger than we are." He stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We might not be able to sway armies, but we can keep each other safe. We should at least fortify Summerhall, send word to Storm's End, and remain alert. If the Lannisters march south, they could eventually come here. Or they might not bother. But we must be prepared." She nodded, new resolve in her voice. Yes, you're right." In the flurry of panic that followed, ravens were dispatched to Storm's End, to Dragonstone, and even to Winterfell, though Jon did not know if those messages would get through. Soldiers improved the palisade walls around the settlement, set watch rotations. The small folk sensed the tension, though they could not fully grasp the reasons. Rumors ran wild. That the king was dead, or that Ned Stark had seized control, that dragons had returned, that the dead were walking in the far north. No one knew which to believe. Jon waited for a raven in return, desperate for news of his father's fate. Night after night he paced, anxiety gnawing at him. He feared the worst. Shireen watched him with anguished sympathy, her own sorrow for her uncle overshadowed by Jon's pain for Ned. The new day came with no word. Then another, and another. The southwestern sky frothed with storms, and the wind whistled through the blackened ruins of Summerhall as though the ghosts of Targaryen kings were lamenting the realm's plight. Days later, a raven arrived from Storm's End. The castellan wrote that King Robert Baratheon had died of his wounds. Joffrey was crowned. Ned Stark was named a traitor and executed. The North was in open revolt. Stannis Baratheon claimed the Iron Throne by right of Robert's passing and Joffrey's alleged illegitimacy. Renly Baratheon also crowned himself, claiming he had more support. War had broken out on every front. The lines had been drawn. In the quiet chamber, Jon felt the world tilt beneath him. His father, executed. He grasped the edge of the table for support, feeling as though a chunk of his soul had been ripped free. Ned Stark had been the rock of Jon's life. Even though there had always been a measure of formality between them, Ned had been the anchor of Jon's identity. Now he was gone, murdered in the name of a false king. A wash of grief and fury poured through Jon, a maelstrom he could barely contain. Shireen whispered his name, stepping forward to steady him. She was crying freely now, tears tracing down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she breathed. "Gods, Jon, I'm so sorry." He stood rigid, breathing hard. "We have war on every side," he said at last, voice hollow. "Stannis, your father, claims the throne. Renly, your uncle, claims the throne. Robb is marching for vengeance in the north. And Joffrey sits the Iron Throne in King's Landing." He stared at the map spread out on the table, a swirl of lines and territories. "We are alone in Summerhall, stuck in the middle of this storm." Shireen swallowed, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "We have each other," she said. "I know it's not enough, but we have each other. Their eyes met. Jon drew her into an embrace, his grief too deep for words. He felt her warmth, the gentle press of her cheek against his. He knew that the realm was on the brink of a bloodbath. But there, amid the scorched ruins, in that moment of heartbreak, the comfort of Shireen's presence was all that kept him from being swallowed by rage. He closed his eyes, resting his chin on the top of her head. "We'll face it together," he whispered. "For the North and for your kin as well. We'll do our duty and find our path in this broken realm. Somehow." Shireen nodded, sniffling, her breath hitching on tears. The thunder rumbled outside as though echoing their turmoil. In that moment, their forced marriage no longer felt like a mere arrangement. It was a fragile lifeline in a world gone mad, an alliance forged by the king, yet turned into something real through the struggles they had endured. Neither knew what would come next, only that they would hold fast to one another, two orphans of the storm, determined to create a future out of the wreckage. The night brought no solace. War had begun. Their illusions were shattered. But in the gloom, Shireen rested in Jon's arms and felt, for perhaps the first time, that she was not simply a tool in someone else's game. She was a wife and a partner, and she would stand by Jon Stark no matter what storms lay ahead. And as for Jon, even as grief for his father tore at him, he gripped Shireen's hand and silently vowed to protect her. She was his wife, his responsibility, and in a realm of swirling chaos, that vow was the one anchor he could hold on to with unwavering faith. So began the next stage of their journey, no longer mere children in a world of lords and kings, but a lord and lady themselves, forged by sorrow and driven by a hope that they might, in time, restore a little piece of order to the devastation that was sure to come. Beneath the blackened stones of Summerhall, the last echoes of Targaryen dreams whispered their warnings, but Jon and Shireen pressed forward with what strength they had. Winter was still far off, and the storms raged in the south. Yet side by side, perhaps they could endure. The morning after the Raven arrived with the terrible news of Ned Stark's execution and King Robert's death, Jon and Shireen awoke to the gloom of a gray sky pressing down upon the half-rebuilt courtyard at Summerhall. Outside, the wind sighed across charred stones, carrying the tang of damp ash. The small folk stirred quietly in their makeshift homes, continuing about their tasks with a resigned caution, for rumors of war had replaced every shred of peace. The War of the Five Kings, people were calling it. Joffrey in King's Landing, Renly and Stannis both in the Stormlands, Robb Stark in the north, and whispers that Balon Greyjoy might stir in the Iron Islands. None of those kings were any comfort to the simple cotters and farmers who lived upon this land. They only knew that battles would spread across the realm like wildfire. Jon rose before dawn, as he had often done in Winterfell, memories of his father, Eddard Stark, weighing on him like a stone in the pit of his stomach. The knowledge that Ned was gone, executed by orders from the Lannisters, left a searing grief in his chest. He moved through the early morning tasks on a sort of autopilot, instructing a group of laborers about reinforcing the perimeter fence, checking the small garrison mustered around the old stable yard. He also spoke quietly to the handful of men who had served as his guard. They were uneasy, for they did not know what stance to take in the tide of open warfare. Some were sworn to House Stark, some to House Baratheon, but their immediate loyalty lay with Jon and Shireen. Now that it was known the realm had fractured, everyone feared the arrival of armies on Summerhall's doorstep. After ensuring the morning watch was set, Jon returned to the main building, still more a skeleton of stone and timber than a proper keep, and found Shireen seated at a crude trestle table, scanning recent letters by the dim glow of a lantern. She was wrapped in a plain cloak, her hair loose around her shoulders, and fatigue had etched faint hollows beneath her eyes. A short bark of thunder rumbled in the distance, portending another storm due later in the day. She glanced up as he entered, letting the scroll in her hand curl closed. "The Castellan at Storm's End writes that Lord Renly has raised his banners," she said softly. "He's calling himself King of the Seven Kingdoms by right of conquest and popular support." Jon exhaled, grim lines deepening around his mouth. "He claims the crown over Stannis. But Stannis is the elder. And from what we know, Stannis is also pressing a claim that Joffrey is not trueborn." Shireen set down the letter. "Renly has the backing of powerful lords in the Reach, the Tyrells especially. It seems many prefer him because he's easier to like than my father." Her tone cracked a little at the mention of Stannis. He was still her father, though a distant one. Meanwhile, the Castellan says that many Storm Lords have declared for Renly, except a few who remain loyal to Stannis or else refuse to commit. Storm's End is still nominally for Renly, but the Castellan is torn. He's not sure if your presence here at Summerhall affects that stance. He asked me for direction. Jon could only shake his head, anger and grief tangling in his chest. "And then there's the north. Robb is raising an army to avenge my father. They say he's crossed the neck, that lords of the Riverlands are flocking to him. He'll be named king in the north if the rumors are true." Shireen folded her hands, her scarred cheek gleaming faintly in the lantern's light. "I never asked for a war with so many kings. I don't want to choose between my father and my uncle or stand against your brother. Yet we're bound up in all this. They might demand an oath from us. Renly might send men to Summerhall to secure it. Or Stannis might come himself, or her breath caught. I don't know." Jon knew he should be comforting her, but he felt nearly as lost. They were a newly married pair of young people stranded in the charred remains of a castle with only a handful of loyalists, no major store of gold, and precarious ties to two warring houses. The king who had forced them together was dead, and every corner of the realm threatened to burn. Even so, there were tasks at hand. "I've ordered more patrols around the perimeter," Jon said. "No one rides beyond a half-day's journey without an escort. We'll keep to ourselves unless forced. The people here look to us for leadership. We should prepare for the possibility that one side or another will come calling with demands." Shireen nodded. "We must keep the peace as long as we can." She forced a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "I've been drafting another letter to Storm's End, explaining that we can't muster men for Renly at the moment. We haven't enough soldiers ourselves. Maybe that will buy us time." Jon's chest tightened with sympathy. She carried so much weight on her shoulders, so much that neither of them had chosen. He touched her hand lightly. "Yes, that's wise." Then he swallowed. "I'm sorry you have to deal with all this, Shireen." Her eyes flickered with grief. "I'm sorry about your father," she whispered. "He was an honorable man, no matter what they said in King's Landing." He managed a nod, jaw tightening. "Thank you." He gently squeezed her hand, wishing he had the words to convey the turbulence inside him. The desire to ride north, to fight alongside Robb, pressed hard in his veins. But he was torn by a sense of duty here. Shireen was his wife. Summerhall was his seat. And if he left, if he abandoned her, she would be vulnerable to any who might want to use her as a pawn. He would not do that, not after everything they had endured. They set about the day's duties with forced composure. Shireen conferred with the steward, checking the supply stockpiles, barley, dried fish, flour. Jon walked the perimeter, ensuring the fences were secure, speaking with the men about how to handle travelers. He was doing just that, discussing watch rotations with a tall youth from the Stormlands, when a horn blew at the edge of the camp. A small party was approaching the gates. Jon's gut clenched. He exchanged a look with the youth, then signaled for the men to be cautious. They hurried to the ramshackle gate. From behind a wooden palisade, Jon saw 4 riders, heads bowed against the drizzle. One bore a banner of golden antlers upon a night-black field, House Baratheon's sigil. Jon recognized the sign not as Renly's, which featured a crowned stag against gold, but as Stannis' personal banner, the black stag within a red heart, sometimes combined with the fiery heart of the Lord of Light. Yet in the gloom, it was hard to see if the red heart was present or if it was a simpler standard. Jon motioned for the gates to be opened slightly, stepping out to greet them. Rain pattered on his cloak and the wind tugged at his hair. The lead rider, a gaunt-faced knight with a sour expression, inclined his head stiffly. "I come on behalf of Lord Stannis Baratheon," he said. His voice carried a note of severity. "He has assumed the mantle of king by right of birth and law. Are you Jon Snow, Jon Stark, as some say, and the Lady Shireen Baratheon?" Jon nodded, not missing that the knight had used both Snow and Stark as though uncertain which to address him by. "I am." He gestured behind him. "And the Lady Shireen is within. What news do you bring?" The knight tugged at his reins, eyeing Jon as if he were an untrustworthy sellsword. "I am Ser Justin Massey. I ride to bid you come to Dragonstone at the king's command." He let the words hang in the air. "Your father-in-law summons you." Jon suppressed a flicker of alarm. He had heard little from Stannis in months. The man had always been famously cold, rigid in his sense of right and wrong. Now that open war was upon them, Stannis must have realized that Shireen's presence could be a tool. "Has Dragonstone declared for war?" Jon asked carefully. Ser Justin's expression hardened. "His Grace has declared the boy Joffrey a usurper born of incest. He claims the throne by law. He has the backing of lords who believe in his cause." He glanced dismissively at the half-built walls of Summerhall. "He also has powerful allies. You and the king's daughter are expected at Dragonstone. The king wishes to ensure her safety." Jon understood the subtext. Stannis wanted Shireen close at hand. Summerhall was an outpost in the Stormlands, vulnerable to Renly's or the Lannisters' armies. Also, the presence of Shireen might help Stannis' cause. Her claim as Robert's recognized niece, married to a newly legitimized Stark, might bring more Northern or Baratheon-allied lords to Stannis' side. Jon felt tension coil in his gut. "We have men here, and the small folk rely on us," he said, glancing toward the courtyard. "It's not so simple to leave Summerhall unprotected." Ser Justin's lip curled. "Summerhall is a ruin, my lord. The king has greater concerns than old stones. You and the princess belong at his side. That is the message." Then he hesitated as if recalling some courtesy. "Begging your pardon, but his grace's orders are clear. You are to depart at once. Should you need assistance, he has sent me and these men to escort you safely to Dragonstone." Jon's first impulse was anger. He nearly said that he was no man's prisoner to be dragged wherever they commanded, but he caught himself. This was Stannis Baratheon's emissary, and Stannis was Shireen's father. To refuse outright would be dangerous. They were in no position to fight Stannis's will if the man truly demanded them. But it was also likely that leaving Summerhall now would cut short all the labor and trust they had built with the local folk. On the other hand, with war raging, perhaps this was the safer course. The King Stannis, as he styled himself, was offering them protection. "Let me speak to my lady," Jon said at last. "We'll give you an answer by dusk." Ser Justin inclined his head stiffly. "Very well, my Lord Stark. We'll wait in the courtyard." Jon beckoned for the gates to open. His soldiers escorted the 4 knights inside, eyeing them warily. Some of the small folk peeked from around corners, uncertain who these new arrivals were or what they wanted. The black stag banner whipped in the rain-lashed air, splotched with mud. Jon found Shireen in the half-roofed hall where the steward was still discussing the day's tasks. The moment he approached, she saw the tension on his face and dismissed the steward with a gesture. "Who are they?" she asked, voice taut. "Emissaries from your father." Jon ran a hand over his damp hair. "Ser Justin Massey and some knights. They've come to demand we go to Dragonstone. Stannis calls himself king and wants you at his side. They're here to escort us, presumably whether we like it or not." Her lips parted and a mixture of anxiety and sorrow crossed her face. "Father, he's always insisted on his rights. If he believes it's his duty to claim the Iron Throne, he won't relent." She clasped her hands, the old scarring on her left cheek standing out starkly. "And if he demands I come to him, it's not as though I have a choice, truly. I am his daughter." Jon exhaled slowly. "Yes. Legally, we could refuse, but that'd be near treason in his eyes, disobedience to the rightful king he claims to be. We don't have the strength to hold off an assault if he decides to force the matter. And if we linger here, we could also face trouble from Renly's supporters. Or from the Lannisters if they turn south in force." Shireen pressed trembling fingers to her temple. "It's all collapsing. It wasn't so long ago that we took comfort in building a new life here, but the war has destroyed any notion of peace." She drew a breath, standing straighter. "You are my husband. I won't go anywhere without you. If you think it best to remain, we can try." A father might see it as defiance. Jon hesitated, heart heavy. He looked around the half-finished hall, rough beams, a battered old table, crates of supplies. The settlement beyond contained maybe 50 or 60 souls, some of them children. He knew that if Stannis decided to punish them for ignoring his summons, Summerhall would be caught in the crossfire. And the war itself could sweep across the Stormlands at any moment, especially with Renly mustering forces not too far away. "We can't protect these people if an entire army descends on us," Jon said. "In truth, if we go to Dragonstone, we might come back later with better resources if the war ends swiftly." Even as he said the words, he doubted a swift end was likely. Shireen nodded, tears threatening to glisten in her eyes, though she blinked them away. "We'll have to trust that the settlement can manage in our absence. Perhaps we can leave men to oversee things. I can't believe we have to abandon them." Jon reached out, setting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We won't abandon them. We'll leave instructions and a steward to handle day-to-day tasks. We'll do what we can. But if your father demands we come, we have little choice, Shireen." She closed her eyes briefly, then drew herself up with that quiet steel that Jon had come to respect. "Then we'll go. Let's meet with Ser Justin and hear more of what father wants." They gathered in the courtyard under the meager shelter of a patch of scaffolding. The rain had intensified, turning the bare ground to slick mud. Shireen stood with her chin lifted, water droplets clinging to the edges of her hood. Ser Justin Massey watched her with a certain grudging respect. She was, after all, the daughter of his lord, newly crowned king in his eyes. Shireen spoke with an authority that belied her youth. "My father summons me, so I will go. My lord husband and I will prepare to depart in 2 days' time. That's the earliest we can be ready. Summerhall requires our instructions before we leave." Ser Justin regarded her, clearly intending to press for immediate travel, but seeing the set of her jaw, he inclined his head. 2 days, no more. We are needed back at Dragonstone, and time is of the essence. The war does not wait. Jon felt a flicker of anger at the man's tone but held his peace. We have men here who can keep the settlement safe. We'll bring a small escort. If you have no objections, Ser Justin, we'll ride to Storm's End and sail from there. Aye, Ser Justin said. The king commands your presence in Dragonstone. Storm's End is in the hands of Renly's men, but we can arrange a ship from one of the lesser harbors or from Massey's Hook. We'll do what we must. Shireen drew in a breath. So be it. For the remainder of that day, Jon and Shireen toiled to put affairs in order. They summoned the lead steward, the local stonemason, and the handful of small folk who took it upon themselves to organize daily tasks. Over the low hiss of rainfall, Jon explained that they were called away by Shireen's father, that conflict raged across the realm, and that they could not say how long they would be gone. He promised them what little coin the settlement possessed for continuing repairs, for ensuring the villagers had enough to eat, and for defending themselves from brigands. He appointed a local Stormlander who had proven honest as acting castellan, instructing him to keep the gates shut for any large host of soldiers that might appear. The small folk reacted with muted dread. Summerhall was not a fortress by any means, only half a ruin with wooden walls, but for many of them, it was better than being scattered. They took Jon's instructions with solemn nods and looks of worry. The children huddled in corners, peeking out with anxious eyes. Shireen offered them encouragement, reminding them that House Baratheon Stark would not forget them. More than once, her voice wavered, revealing how uneasy she felt to be leaving them all behind. When night fell, they retired to their modest chamber in what had once been a guest wing of the old castle. A partial roof had been installed months ago, providing enough shelter to keep the wind at bay. Jon lit a single lantern, the flame dancing across stone walls blackened by ancient soot. Shireen sank onto the edge of the small bed, rubbing her arms as though chilled. Jon joined her, setting the lantern on a rough-hewn table. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I've barely seen Father in years. The last time was after my name day, when I was still at Dragonstone. He's so cold, Jon. Driven by duty and law, never swayed by emotion. And now he's declared himself king." She looked at the wall. "Sometimes I don't know if he truly cares for me, or if I'm just another piece on his board." Jon gently rested a hand on her knee. "I can't pretend I know him better than you do, but even a harsh father can have some care for his child." He paused, thinking of Ned Stark, who had been stern yet always had a deep well of love for his children, trueborn or otherwise. "We'll face him together." She drew in a shaky breath, then placed her hand over his. "Thank you. I'm grateful you're with me. I don't think I could do this alone." His chest tightened with a rush of protectiveness. "You'll never have to," he said. They shared a quiet closeness that night, more comfort than passion, though the bond between them had grown. They fell asleep listening to the wind moaning through the cracks in the walls, each haunted by the weight of what the next days would bring. Morning broke with a murky, half-hearted sun behind iron-gray clouds. Jon and Shireen readied themselves to leave Summerhall. Their garrison of about 10 loyal men, plus 2 maids and a steward, prepared to join them. Ser Justin Massey was impatient from the start, urging haste. "We must not linger," he said curtly as they loaded a pair of wagons with provisions. "The roads are dangerous and Renly's forces move quickly." Jon bit back a scathing reply. He made sure to leave behind half their small company to guard the settlement. No sense stripping Summerhall bare. The small folk came to bid them farewell. It was a somber procession. Shireen tried to speak encouraging words to the children, telling them that she would come back one day. The children's faces were pensive, but a few managed hopeful nods. Then, under a low sky, they rode away from Summerhall's battered gate, uncertain if they would ever truly return. The settlement's precarious fences and half-standing walls disappeared behind them as they followed a muddy path heading east. Jon rode at Shireen's side, while Ser Justin and his knights scouted ahead. The bulk of their own men followed close behind the wagons, forming a modest column. They traveled for hours along rutted tracks that wound through rolling hills and patches of wet forest. Rain threatened but held off, leaving only a damp chill. The party spoke little, tension heavy in the air. At midday, they halted near a small stream, letting the horses drink. Ser Justin paced impatiently, scanning the horizon. Jon tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the route. He had studied the maps. If they continued southeast, they would reach the coast near Massey's Hook, a region dotted with small ports and fishing villages. From there, they could potentially catch a ship to Dragonstone. The second day of travel brought no respite. The land was bleak, battered by wind, with spiny, dark-leafed trees creeping along ridges. They encountered no major roads, just narrow lanes cut by travelers over time. Once, they spotted a band of armed riders in the distance, but neither group sought engagement. Raiding parties were everywhere in these days of chaos, and caution reigned. By the third evening, the travelers beheld the ragged coastline of the Stormlands, waves crashing against stony beaches. Ser Justin guided them to a small cove where a single battered galley awaited, flying a banner of the Flaming Heart and Stag. The king's men. They made camp on a bluff above the beach. The galley would depart at first light, carrying Jon, Shireen, and a portion of their men across the turbulent waters to Dragonstone. The rest would remain behind to guard the wagons or find separate passage later. The night was cold, the wind shrieking off the sea like a banshee. Jon found Shireen standing on the bluff's edge, staring out into the darkness, her cloak whipping around her thin frame. He moved to her side. "Are you all right?" She glanced at him with haunted eyes. "I was just thinking. I used to dream about the sea near Dragonstone. The storms would rattle the windows and I'd wonder if the castle would ever be swept away. I never liked that place very much, it felt lonely even though I was surrounded by people. At least at Summerhall, we were building something new. Here, it's like returning to an old prison." Jon's heart clenched with empathy. "We'll see how things stand now that your father has proclaimed himself king. Dragonstone might be full of new faces, lords and knights sworn to him." "Yes," she murmured, "Melisandre of Askvi too, I've heard." She shivered involuntarily. There are rumors she brought some new god with her. The Lord of Light, they call him. That she has magical powers. I don't know what to believe. Jon had heard the same whispers. Stannis was not known to be devout, yet rumor said he had burned the statues of the Seven and declared for the Red God. In a time of war and chaos, perhaps men grasped any faith that promised victory. He wrapped an arm around Shireen's shoulders, offering warmth against the salt-laden wind. "We'll keep our wits about us," he said. "Whatever gods Stannis chooses, we're not obliged to accept them. We have our own hearts to guide us." She leaned against him. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." At dawn, the sea was steel gray under a bruised sky. The small galley rocked at the end of a short pier. Jon helped Shireen aboard, uneasy about the crossing. He was a man of the north, not accustomed to ships. Ser Justin gave curt orders to the sailors who hustled to raise the sail. Within an hour, they were underway, slicing through choppy waters. As the land behind them receded, Jon couldn't help but feel as though they were heading deeper into the heart of a storm. The crossing took most of the day, the vessel pitching on rough swells. Shireen looked pale, but she bore up without complaint, hands clenched on the rail. Jon found himself scanning the horizon, occasionally glimpsing the silhouette of a distant warship. The narrow sea around Dragonstone was known for sudden squalls. He prayed the weather would hold, though thick clouds loomed. By dusk, the island fortress of Dragonstone rose out of the sea. Carved gargoyles and dragons perched on black stone walls, the ancient seat of House Targaryen now claimed by Stannis Baratheon. Jon saw towers shaped like twisted dragons' tails, a design older than the conquest itself. It looked foreboding in the twilight, as though ghosts of the old dynasty haunted every corner. The galley eased into a small harbor overshadowed by the basalt cliffs. Stannis' banner hung limply in the damp air, the black stag in a field of red flame. A group of soldiers awaited on the dock, all of them wearing Stannis' sigil on their chests. Jon guided Shireen onto the pier, the spray from the waves cold on his cheeks. Ser Justin signaled to a tall man who stood at attention, presumably an officer. Wordless glances were exchanged, then the man beckoned Jon and Shireen to follow up a steep path carved into the rock. The clang of a distant smithy echoed across the courtyard as they entered Dragonstone's walls. The keep was a labyrinth of black stone, with stylized dragons decorating every arch and parapet. A few men and women in Baratheon livery paused in their tasks to gawk at the newcomers. Even in the gloom, the fortress seemed alive with tension, soldiers drilling in the yard, voices raised in arguments behind closed doors. War was in the air. They were escorted through torchlit corridors, the walls carved with serpentine shapes. Shireen's face was set, but Jon could sense the dread tightening in her posture. She had known Dragonstone as a child, but now everything seemed transformed by Stannis' new role. At length, they reached a pair of towering doors. Guards pushed them open, revealing a cavernous chamber lit by flickering braziers. There, at the far end, a single table had been set up, overshadowed by a sculpture of a dragon's head. Behind it stood a gaunt man in black and red, with a darkly bearded face, hawk-like features, and eyes that burned with cold intensity. Stannis Baratheon. Beside him stood a woman robed in red, her hair the color of copper flames. Melisandre of Ass High, Jon guessed, though he had never met her. Others stood nearby, a cluster of knights and attendants, some wearing the flaming heart over black. Silence fell as Jon and Shireen were brought forward. Stannis' gaze fell upon them like a weight. He studied Shireen first, lingering on the scars that marked her cheek. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. Then he nodded curtly. "Shireen," he said, voice as blunt as a cudgel. "At last you've come." She stepped forward, bowing her head. "Father, I came as you commanded." He turned that stern gaze on Jon, taking in the Stark leathers, the sword at Jon's hip, the newly embroidered dire wolf badge. "And you are Eddard Stark's boy, though the crown has named you legitimate." His mouth twisted. "Jon Stark, or so they call you." Jon inclined his head, measuring his words carefully. "Yes, your grace. I wed Shireen by King Robert's decree." Stannis nodded, with a grim flick of his hand. "It was my brother's doing. A union of the North and the Stormlands. I cannot fault the notion. But times have changed since he so foolishly hunted that boar." Jon held his composure. "He was your brother. I'm sorry for your loss, your grace." Stannis' jaw tightened. "I had greater losses than a brother who paid no mind to his duties. My father died at Storm's End. My mother died when I was a boy. Robert, yes, we were close once, but he was never the same after he took that damned throne. And now I bear the burden." The red woman beside him, Melisandre, smiled faintly, her red robes swaying. "The Lord of Light has chosen your grace to bring justice and truth to the realm." Stannis did not respond to her in words, but something in his posture suggested a tacit endorsement. He shifted his attention back to Shireen. "You're grown taller, child. I trust you have not forgotten your letters or your duties to House Baratheon." She shook her head, voice subdued. "No, father." He gestured for them to approach the table. On its surface, Jon saw a large map of Westeros rendered in elaborate detail. Dozens of wooden markers were arranged on it, each representing various armies or strongholds. Stannis tapped the region near King's Landing. "The Lannisters cling to the Iron Throne with that whelp Joffrey, but I have declared him baseborn, Cersei's incestuous spawn. I have sent letters throughout the realm announcing the truth. Renly has usurped the seat at Storm's End, calling himself king, but he is the younger brother and has no right by law or by birth. Meanwhile, the boy from the north, your brother, if you claim Ned Stark, styles himself king in the north, though that claim is equally treasonous if we speak of the unity of the Seven Kingdoms." Jon's jaw flexed. He chose his words carefully. "Robb has done so in response to my father's execution. He believes the crown in King's Landing is false." Melisandre's red lips curved slightly. "And what does that make the rightful king, my lord? Do you deny Stannis Baratheon's rightful inheritance?" Jon felt a flash of anger at her tone, but he kept it in check. "I do not deny it, my lady. I only say that the North has endured much injustice. They are driven by grief and vengeance. My father was an honorable man." Stannis lifted a hand, cutting through the tension. "Your father was indeed honorable. He supported my brother on the throne. He would not have abided in abomination like Joffrey. Nor would he have followed Renly's spurious claim. If Eddard Stark had lived, perhaps he would have thrown his weight behind me. But now the kingdom is splintered." His eyes bored into Jon's. "You are Ned's son. You bear the name Stark. Perhaps the North would bend the knee to me if you commanded it." Jon's chest clenched. He glanced at Shireen, who stood with an anxious expression, and then at Stannis. The man's question was a trap, or at least a demand. "Your Grace," Jon said carefully, "I have no authority over the North. My half-brother, Robb, leads the armies, supported by great lords. They do not look to me for commands." Stannis' lips pressed into a white line. "But they might if I named you Warden of the North in Robb's stead. The boy is barely older than you, and he has declared himself a king, an act of rebellion. You, however, are married to my daughter. That ties you to House Baratheon. If you were recognized as the rightful Stark in place of Robb." "Father, please," Shireen interjected, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, hands clasped. "Jon's brother is dear to him. He can't simply turn on his family. Surely there must be another way." Stannis' face showed no softening. "Another way to unify this realm before it tears itself apart? Are you so naive, child? Or cares little for sentiment?" If your husband's brother insists on a separate crown, the North will war with the rest of the realm. Thousands will die. If we bring them to heel swiftly, or if we can turn them to our side, fewer lives might be lost. Jon forced himself to remain calm. I won't betray Robb. He's my brother. The words came out steadily, though part of him feared Stannis might grow enraged. If you wish to negotiate an alliance, perhaps we can find terms. The North wants justice for Ned Stark's death, wants the Lannisters out of power. You share the goal. If you declare that you will avenge Ned's murder, that might sway some of the Northern lords. A muscle in Stannis' jaw twitched. You would have me kneel to your brother? Or beg him to kneel to me in exchange for promises? That is not how I do things. Melisandre watched with an unreadable smile as though observing a dance. The Lord of Light grants us the power to see illusions for what they are. Robb Stark's claim is built on sorrow. Stannis Baratheon's is built on truth. The truth must prevail. Jon felt his frustration rising. What is truth, my lady? That Joffrey is not Robert's son? I believe it. But many in the North would ask why the rightful claim belongs to Stannis, not Renly, not Robb. Law. Stannis hissed, striking the table with his palm. The wooden markers rattled. Law and birth order. I am Robert's heir, older than Renly, no incest stain on my name. Your brother, or half-brother, has no claim to the Iron Throne, no matter how many men he musters. Jon studied the older man's face. He saw no malice, only a rigid sense of duty. Then I propose a parley, he said quietly. If I could write to Robb, entreat him to meet with your grace, somewhere neutral, perhaps we could form an alliance against the Lannisters. That would be the greater threat, no? Then, after that threat is ended, the matter of the North might be decided peacefully. Melisandre scoffed softly, but Stannis raised a hand to silence her. His stare bored into Jon. For a moment, silence stretched. Then he said, You think your brother would agree? I can't speak for him, Jon admitted. But the North is not eager to remain subject to a throne that murdered Ned Stark. If you offered them respect and recognized their traditions, perhaps even some measure of autonomy, they might bend the knee to your crown, but not to Joffrey's. That is all I can promise. Stannis' eyes flickered. Write your letter, then. I will consider sending an envoy to meet him. He straightened as though the matter were closed for now. But do not take me for a fool. If the boy spurns me, I will bring the full might of the Iron Throne against him once I have taken King's Landing. And you, as my son-in-law, will be required to do your duty. Is that understood? Jon nodded, tension thrumming in his body. Yes. Stannis' gaze shifted to Shireen, lingering on her with an almost imperceptible softness. In the meantime, you will remain at Dragonstone, child, under my protection. The realm is no place for you to wander. War is upon us. I should never have left you in King's Landing so long. Shireen lowered her eyes. Yes, father. He gestured to one of his knights. Show them to chambers suitable for my daughter and her husband. See that they are kept comfortable. Then he leveled a final look at Jon. Write your letter to the North, to your brother, but do not fill his head with false hopes. I am the rightful king. In time, I will wear the crown in truth. Jon bowed stiffly. Thank you for your mercy, your grace. He did not miss the weight of meaning behind the word mercy, for Stannis' tolerance might be fleeting. They were led away, Shireen clinging to Jon's arm as they ascended winding steps cut into black stone. The corridors were lit by torches, the flames dancing on walls carved with dragons. The soldier leading them paused before a pair of heavy doors, pushing them open to reveal a suite with a hearth, a modest bedchamber, and a view of the storm-racked sea from a narrow window. Old tapestries in Targaryen colors, black and red, still hung from the walls, dusty and worn. Shireen stepped inside, looking around with an uneasy expression. My old room was smaller than this, she murmured. But all of Dragonstone feels different now. The soldier bowed slightly. If you need anything, let the guards outside know. With that, he departed, shutting the door behind him. Jon let out a breath, heavy with pent-up tension. He removed his damp cloak, draping it over a wooden chair. Shireen sank onto the edge of the bed, eyes distant. He wants me here, perhaps for my safety, but also for his advantage. She swallowed, glancing at Jon. And if he marches on King's Landing, or if Renly does, or if both of them do, the realm could be drowned in blood. Jon joined her, clasping her hand. We'll do what we can to broker a truce, or at least direct their wrath at the Lannisters first. I'll write Robb tonight, telling him what's happened. If he's wise, he'll see that we share a common enemy. I can't promise he'll accept Stannis' authority in the end, but perhaps we can keep them from warring with each other right away. Her eyes glistened with tears she tried not to shed. I only wish we had more power to stop this madness. It's as though all the realm's heartbreak is culminating in this war. And I'm stuck in the middle, father's only child pinned beneath his ambitions. Jon wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. You're not alone. We'll face whatever comes. That night, as the wind shrieked outside the thick walls, Jon penned a letter to Robb. He chose his words with agonizing care, explaining that he was at Dragonstone with Shireen, that Stannis had laid claim to the throne and declared war on the Lannisters, denouncing Joffrey's parentage. Jon urged Robb to consider alliance, or at least a parley that might lead to an understanding. If they wasted their strength fighting each other, the Lannisters would triumph. He mentioned that Stannis was cold but honorable in his own severe way, that Robert's death and Ned's murder had changed the realm forever. He told Robb that for the sake of House Stark's survival, an accord with Stannis might be the only path to see justice done. In closing, Jon acknowledged that if the North refused every southern claim, war between them and Stannis was inevitable. He could do no more. He affixed his newly minted seal, a dire wolf and a stag combined, signifying House Stark and House Baratheon, and gave the scroll to a steward who promised to dispatch it via Raven at first light. Whether it reached Robb in time, or whether Robb would read it in good faith, Jon did not know. The next days at Dragonstone passed slowly. The keep was a hive of military preparations, knights drilling, blacksmiths forging new swords and spearheads, supplies packed in crates bound for some rumored fleet. Jon gleaned that Stannis was building ships for a planned assault on King's Landing, though the details were guarded closely by his commanders. Lawler, the Red God, was invoked at dawn each day by Melisandre and her acolytes, who burned effigies of the 7 statues on a pyre in the courtyard, chanting in a language Jon did not recognize. He watched from a distance, disquieted by the fervor in their eyes. Shireen was kept under discreet guard, though she was permitted to roam certain halls. She saw little of her father except at mealtimes, in a solemn hall that had once been the Targaryens' feasting chamber. Even then, Stannis was curt, more preoccupied with war than with conversation. When Shireen tried to speak of her time at Summerhall, of the small folk who were building a new life, he only nodded absently. Jon suspected Stannis did care in his way, but duty always overshadowed paternal warmth. On the 4th day, a new arrival caused a stir. Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, had returned from a mission. Jon glimpsed the man in the courtyard, a weathered fellow with a missing joint or two on one hand, clad in simple attire. He was ushered straight to the War Council. By evening, an atmosphere of excitement swept the fortress. Servants whispered that Davos had found allies or ships to bolster Stannis' cause. Melisandre was rumored to be urging immediate action, speaking of visions in the flames. That night, Shireen and Jon retired to their chamber after a sparse supper of fish and boiled vegetables. Jon paced, restless. The ravens had come and gone, but there was no reply from Robb. Perhaps the message had not reached him yet. Perhaps it had, and Robb had chosen to ignore it. Anxiety twisted in Jon's gut. Shireen sat near the hearth, arms around her knees. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the old scars. "Jon," she said softly, "Father will attack King's Landing soon. I can feel it. And if he takes the city, what then? Will Robb see that as a chance to break free? Or will Father then turn his armies north?" Jon rubbed at his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "If Robb doesn't respond, Stannis may assume the North has chosen war. There's talk that your uncle Renly has tens of thousands of Reachmen with him, not to mention Stormlords. If Stannis goes against Renly first, who knows how that ends? Or if he tries King's Landing before Renly, maybe he'll face the Lannisters' defenders. Either way, it's going to be bloody." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the snapping of the fire. Finally, Shireen asked in a trembling voice, "What if the realm breaks apart? Where will that leave us? And the small folk and Summerhall and everything we tried to build?" Jon went to kneel beside her. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we can't give up on the chance to do some good. We'll wait for word from Robb, keep pressing Stannis for a parley. Maybe if we can resolve this without entire armies clashing." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder. "I'm so tired of being powerless," she whispered. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "Me too." The next day brought another wave of tension. Just after dawn, a horn sounded in the courtyard. Jon, who had been finishing a quick breakfast, rushed to see what the commotion was. Soldiers were gathering near the gates. A messenger from Renly Baratheon had arrived, flanked by a dozen men in bright green and gold, the colors of House Tyrell interwoven with the crowned stag of Renly's banner. They bore a letter addressed to Stannis. Jon watched from a balcony overlooking the courtyard as the messenger demanded audience. Soon enough, the group was escorted inside. The courtyard buzzed with speculation. Hours later, the men departed, leaving behind a hush that felt heavier than any storm cloud. Whispers spread. Renly offered Stannis a chance to renounce his claim and swear fealty to the younger brother, in exchange for some courtesy rank. Stannis, predictably, had refused. A confrontation seemed inevitable. For her part, Melisandre preached that the false king Renly would perish in darkness, that the Lord of Light would cast him down. Jon listened with mounting apprehension. Days bled into nights. Jon composed another letter to Robb describing how matters stood. Renly and Stannis were on a collision course, both claiming the Baratheon name and lineage, and Joffrey sat enthroned in King's Landing behind Lannister gold. The war would soon escalate. Still, no ravens came back from the north. Shireen tried to keep up hope. She studied maps with Jon, searching for some sign that might help. Late one evening, as they sat by a hearth with the wind howling through Dragonstone's towers, Davos Seaworth himself knocked on their door. He wore a plain cloak but carried himself with a quiet confidence. When Jon opened the door, Davos inclined his head politely. "My lord, my lady," he said, "beg your pardon, but I wish to speak with you." Jon glanced at Shireen, then back at Davos. "Come in, sire." Davos stepped inside, glancing around the modest chamber. He lowered his voice. "I've just returned from a mission. His Grace is planning to sail soon, but the manner of it is uncertain. I know you've spoken of bridging peace between King Stannis and your brother in the north. May I ask, do you truly believe an accord is possible?" Shireen, perched on a stool by the hearth, answered softly. "I want to believe so. I know my father well enough to see he won't bow to anyone. But perhaps a truce could be forged, to deal with the Lannisters first." Davos nodded gravely. "I share that hope, my lady. Our real enemy sits the Iron Throne, though your grace insists that Renly's claim must be dealt with first. And the Lannisters, well, they're already spinning their webs. I fear the realm will bleed." He gave Jon a sympathetic look. "I was with your father, Eddard Stark, during Robert's rebellion. Not at his side, mind, but we fought for the same cause. He was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss." Painful lump rose in Jon's throat. "Thank you," he managed. "I only wish we'd had more time, or that I could have been there to help him." Davos sighed. Well, the times we live in are cruel. I came here tonight because I sensed that King Stannis might listen to you, both of you, more than to me. He does care for his daughter in his way. If you can convince him to speak with your brother, or to hold off on fighting 2 wars at once, maybe we can spare the realm some measure of chaos." Jon grimaced. "I've tried. He told me to write to Robb. I have. I've written twice, but I have yet to hear any reply." Davos's expression was sober. "And if none comes?" "The king is set on sailing for Storm's End soon, where Renly is gathering his strength. Word has it that Renly plans to march on King's Landing. If that happens, Stannis wants to face him first, declare that only one Baratheon can be king." He hesitated. "It might lead to bloodshed in the Stormlands, many good men on both sides killing each other." Shireen's eyes brimmed with sorrow. "I don't want that." Davos nodded. "Nor do I, my lady. But the king is a man of unwavering conviction. If he believes the law is on his side, he'll not yield. I thought maybe you could try again, remind him that House Stark might be a powerful ally if he becourts their favor." Jon exchanged a look with Shireen, then nodded. "We'll try, though I doubt it'll deter him from confronting Renly if Renly presses his own claim." Davos gave a small, tired smile. "That's all any of us can do, try." He rose, bowing slightly. "I won't trouble you further. I only hope that your presence here can help temper the king's wrath. We need cooler heads before the storms break us all." When Davos left, Shireen sighed heavily. "He's a good man," she murmured. "Father is fortunate to have him." "Yes," Jon agreed quietly. "But I fear even Davos may not be able to sway him." He moved closer, resting a hand on her arm. "We'll do what we can." If it comes to a clash with Renly, perhaps we can persuade father to hold off. Or persuade Renly to talk peace. Shireen stared into the flickering flames. Renly? I barely know him. I remember him as the charming uncle who smiled more than father did. Boo. That was long ago. How did it come to this, brother against brother, claiming crowns in place of Joffrey's false one? Jon didn't have an answer. Within the week, the castle roiled with preparations for departure. Ships were readied, knights armed, and supply crates loaded. Every corridor echoed with purposeful footsteps. Jon learned that Stannis intended to sail for Storm's End with part of his fleet, leaving behind a garrison to hold Dragonstone. Melisandre was to accompany him, for she claimed to have foreseen that Renly would soon fall. Whispers abounded that a confrontation was imminent. One evening, Stannis summoned Jon and Shireen to a small solar with shutters barred against the wind. A brazier glowed in the corner, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The king stood near a map-laden table while Melisandre observed from a distance, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Davos was there as well, along with a few stern-faced knights. Stannis fixed them with his usual intensity. We sail at dawn. You will come with me, Shireen. I want you under my protection. Shireen tensed, but she did not protest. And Jon? Stannis nodded curtly. He will accompany us too. You are husband and wife, and I want no claim that I've separated you. Some lords might spin that as cruelty or suspicion. Better that you remain at my side where I can see you. The words were blunt, though Jon sensed it was as much about leveraging their symbolic presence as about paternal concern. Are we expecting battle? Jon asked, trying to keep his tone calm. Stannis' face darkened. Likely, but I still hold some faint hope that Renly will see reason and stand aside for his rightful king. If not, we fight? Shireen swallowed. Will you attack Storm's End, father? Stannis' lips pressed flat. If Renly forces it. That castle was once under my command, but Robert granted it to me after the rebellion. Now Renly took it upon Robert's death. I do not relish the idea of besieging it yet again, but neither can I let a false king hold it. Melisandre stepped forward, her red robes whispering against the floor. The Lord of Light will guide us. The usurper's shadow will fail beneath Lawleress' cleansing fire. She turned her strange, calm gaze on Shireen. Trust in his flame, child. You shall not be harmed. Shireen faltered under that gaze, nodding stiffly. Jon frowned, unsettled by Melisandre's serene certainty. He suspected she had some dark conjuration in mind, but he held his tongue. Stannis gave them final instructions. They were to prepare their belongings, board one of the war galleys at dawn. The journey to Storm's End might take less than a day if the weather favored them. As they left the solar, a hush weighed on them both. Jon escorted Shireen to their room, where she stood in front of the small chest of her belongings, hands trembling. A battle. Storm's End besieged by father's fleet. Renly has thousands, I hear. What if father is overwhelmed? What if we're captured? Jon touched her shoulder gently. We'll adapt. We'll try to negotiate a truce if we can. Maybe we can speak to Renly's envoys, reason with him. She let out a bitter laugh. Reason rarely holds sway once swords are drawn. Then she sighed, pressing a hand to her face. We'll do our best, as always. They set about packing in silence. Dawn arrived all too quickly, with the fortress stirring under the horns that signaled the fleet's departure. Scores of soldiers filed down to the docks, clad in Baratheon black and red, or in the new sigil featuring the fiery heart. Stannis himself rode in a curtain litter along with Melisandre, though he disdained comfort for any more than short distances. Shireen walked with Jon, a small guard around them. The sky was a dull pewter, heavy with clouds. The sea churned around the black rocks of Dragonstone's harbor. They boarded a galley named Fury, the flagship of Stannis' fleet. It bristled with scorpions and ballistae, and the forecastle bore the crowned stag device. The sailors, grim-faced, scrambled to raise sails. Shireen and Jon were shown to a cramped cabin near the stern. Though it was small, it at least had a porthole for air. Shireen sank onto a narrow bunk, silent with apprehension. Jon forced a reassuring tone. We'll stay together through this, Shireen. She nodded, but her eyes shimmered. I'm afraid, for father, for Renly, for the men who will die. War is such a horror. Jon wished he could say something that would chase away her fear, but he did not lie to her. It is, he said quietly. With a creak of timbers, the fleet set sail, dozens of ships cutting through the waters around Dragonstone. The wind gusted from the southeast, filling the sails. Jon and Shireen ventured onto the deck briefly, feeling the salt spray on their faces. From the rear of the flagship, they could see the mast lines of other galleys, some large, some smaller, each flying Stannis' banners. Overhead, the sky threatened a gale, but so far the seas were navigable. The crossing took much of the day. By late afternoon, the outline of the Stormlands coastline materialized, dark cliffs rising from the tumult of the sea. The horns blew, signaling that Storm's End was in sight. Stannis, standing near the prow with Melisandre and a cluster of knights, peered through a spyglass. Jon could not hear what they said, but from the tension in Stannis's shoulders it was clear that the castle was well guarded. Indeed, as they approached, they saw the fortress perched on its massive curtain wall, defying the crashing waves. Storm's End was a marvel of thick, curved walls built to withstand the fury of the elements. And upon the battlements Renly's banners flew, the golden stag on a green field. Thousands of campfires ringed the landward side of the castle, an army encamped. Jon glimpsed bright colors, Tyrell greens, Florent heraldry, though some Florents had defected to Stannis, hosts from the Reach. A formidable host, by the look of it. Renly's strength was rumored to be the greatest in the south. The fleet anchored off the coast, battered by the relentless wind. Longboats were lowered, carrying men toward a small cove outside the fortress's walls. Jon and Shireen, with a select guard, joined Stannis' retinue in the first wave. Dusk settled in as they came ashore, trudging up a stony beach. Storm's End loomed black against the stormy sky. They established a makeshift camp just beyond bowshot of the castle's outer walls. Stannis' men erected tents by torchlight, the wind snapping at the canvas. The ground was rocky, strewn with driftwood, not ideal for a large army, but Stannis had no more than a few thousand with him. The rest were on other ships or yet to arrive. Even so, they lit their fires and raised their standards. By the time night fully descended, both sides glared at each other across the darkness, separated by the fortress's mighty ramparts and a wide stretch of cleared ground. Jon wondered if war horns would blare at any moment, if Renly would lead a charge to crush Stannis' smaller force. But the night passed tensely without open battle. Perhaps Renly awaited dawn or wanted to see if Stannis would negotiate. Jon's hope rose. Maybe there was still time to broker some manner of peace. But as they huddled in a hastily pitched tent, Jon, Shireen, and a few silent guards, the wind outside howled. Something about it felt ominous, like the breath of some ancient beast. Shireen dozed fitfully against Jon's shoulder. He kept an ear perked for any alarm, any clash of steel. He heard only the roar of wind, the distant thunder of waves crashing on the cliffs below. At some point, deep in the night, Jon drifted into uneasy slumber. He dreamt of Ned Stark's face, of Winterfell's courtyard blanketed in snow, of Robb riding away to war. Then, abruptly, he woke. He wasn't certain what stirred him, perhaps a slight chill in the air, or a strange hush. He realized Shireen was awake too, sitting up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Jon," she whispered, "listen." He strained his ears. The wind had died, replaced by an uncanny stillness. Then he heard a distant cry, as if from somewhere near the castle walls. Another cry abruptly cut off. A chill prickled across Jon's skin. He gently disentangled from Shireen and reached for his sword. "Stay here," he murmured. She caught his arm. "No, don't go alone." One of their guards near the entrance to the tent stirred, blinking. "My lord, is something amiss?" Before Jon could answer, there was a sound like a roar of wind rushing across the cliffs, followed by an uncanny silence. Then shouts broke out in Stannis' camp. Jon shoved aside the tent flap, stepping into the cold night air. Torches flickered, men stumbled about in confusion. Off to the right, near the path that led around the castle's outer curtain, a cluster of knights was running with swords drawn. Jon heard someone cry, "Assassin." Assassin in the night. A single horn blast cut through the night. More men roused, seizing weapons. Shireen came up beside Jon, ignoring his attempt to keep her back. The camp was in disarray, with shadows lurching amid flickering torchlight. Melisandre's voice carried across the darkness, "He is fallen. The usurper is dead. The night is ours." Jon's stomach turned. He hurried forward, pushing through knots of soldiers. Up ahead, he saw Stannis standing with Davos Seaworth and a few knights near a rocky outcropping. The king's face was grim, lit by torch flames. At his feet lay a figure on the ground, half-shrouded in shadows. A small group of men in green cloaks knelt around the body, wailing in despair. Jon's heart lurched. He recognized the golden Stagan Rose sigils on those cloaks. They were Renly's men. He stepped closer, numb with shock, and glimpsed a face half-hidden by swirling shadows. Renly Baratheon. A dagger protruded from his chest. Blood stained his fine green doublet. His eyes stared blankly at the night sky, open in death. Pandemonium ensued. Some of Renly's knights were bawling, others calling for revenge. Stannis' men brandished weapons, uncertain if an attack was imminent. Yet the shock was so great that no one immediately lunged. Jon caught fragments of shouts, "King Renly is slain." A monstrous sorcery. He was alive in his tent a moment ago. Shireen stood beside Jon, horror etched on her features. "Oh gods, Jon, what?" Before she could finish, Melisandre glided forward, her red robes swirling in the torchlight. "The false king has fallen," she intoned, eyes fixed on Renly's corpse. His hour was not to be. The Lord of Light has chosen his champion. Jon's blood ran cold as he stared at the scene. This was no normal battle, it was an assassination. Possibly by some sorceress means. He caught Davos' Seaworth's stricken expression, the man's mouth set in a grim line. Stannis, too, looked haunted as though he had not expected it to happen this way, but he did not speak. The hush broke as some of Renly's men fled in dismay, others surrendered to Stannis' knights or were forced to kneel. Still others howled that they would never bend the knee to the murderer. The seeds of chaos had been sown. In the confusion, the main host at Storm's End might soon find out their king was dead. Whether they would yield to Stannis or fight to avenge Renly was anyone's guess. Shireen clutched Jon's arm, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He was father's brother," she whispered, voice trembling. How could this happen?" Jon's heart pounded, his mind reeling at the sight of Melisandre's triumphant expression. He feared that this was the beginning of a darker chapter in the war, one fueled by magic and fanaticism beyond the normal horrors of steel on steel. Stannis' path to the throne had been paved that night in a swirl of shadows. Jon was left to wonder how far it would go and what it would cost them all. Yet, in the face of that horror, he held Shireen close, shielding her from the sight of Renly's lifeless eyes. The war was far from over, but the world had shifted irrevocably. Whatever came next, they were trapped in the middle. A young woman bound by blood to a father who embraced fire and shadows, and a legitimized bastard who had once dreamed only of belonging. The storm had only just begun.